Welcome to the Natural Podcast of Selborne, hosted by Gilbert White's House and Gardens. I am Kimberly James, the Collections Manager here at Gilbert White's House. I love Gilbert White, but wish I knew a little bit more about the natural world he describes. So, every fortnight we take a deep dive into Gilbert White's pioneering 1789 book, The Natural History of Selborne, to learn a little bit more about the natural world, both in the 18th century and today. We will talk to some amazing experts and all become a little bit more Gilbert.
It has been my misfortune never to have had any neighbours whose studies have led them towards the pursuit of natural knowledge, so that, for want of a companion to quicken my industry and sharpen my attention, I have made but slender progress in a kind of information to which I have been attached from my childhood.
Hello, welcome back. Today is an auspicious occasion as we have left behind the introductory letters and we are on to the real deal, the real letters. Letter 10 was written to Thomas Pennant, and the date that is set is the 4th of August 1767. So Gilbert is around 47 years old and was just on the cusp of his more official naturalist career, if you can say that. So he was on the cusp of becoming Gilbert White, the naturalist that we know and love today. This letter is choppy and changey. It is mainly about swallows. Swallows will be coming up a lot in future episodes. There is a reason that our museum logo is a swallow. And then he flits onto harvest mouse, falcons, you name it, it's in the letter. But what I'm actually really interested in this episode and what we're going to talk to our guest about is how Gilbert White wrote the natural history of Selborne, who this mysterious Thomas Pennant is that the letter is addressed to, and who was Gilbert White connected with? Was he writing here in Selborne on his own, or was there a network and a community of naturalists around him? So we are talking to Steph Holt today. Steph is an ecologist, a educator, a museum professional, a historian. She is currently working on her PhD and has written on British wildlife, Gilbert White's London, the manuscript of the Natural History of Selborne, and on Thomas Pennant. So we are in extremely safe hands today. So I think, as today is probably going to be a slightly longer episode, I will leave it there and get into the main interview.
How strange is it that the swift, which seems to live exactly the same life with the swallow and house martin, should leave us before the middle of August invariably, while the latter stay often until the middle of October, and once I saw numbers of house martins on the 7th of November.
Well, welcome, Steph, on this gloriously sunny afternoon.
Beautiful, isn't it? So lucky.
It's always sunny in Selborne, obviously.
Yes, definitely, always.
So today we are talking about letter 10, which is an exciting letter because this is the first of our real, genuine letters that Gilbert actually wrote to other people, rather than being a letter that's within the book as sort of an introduction to the book. And you are probably the most qualified person to talk about this letter for so many reasons. A, because your background in ecology and natural history, your lifelong love of Gilbert White, your work on Thomas Pennant, and your in-depth work on how the manuscript was written. So to be honest, I probably couldn't think of anybody better suited to talk about this letter than you. So do you want to just explain a little bit about your background and how we've come to this point?
Sure, okay. So yeah, as you mentioned, my CV looks a little bit like the wanderings of a madwoman through conservation, ecology, and now increasingly into history. I have always been a naturalist. There are terrible pictures of me from when I was a child of me wandering around in the Purbeck Hills as a small nerd, collecting, spotting anything I possibly could. But over time, my career took me into ecology through university down in Dorset and then up in Birmingham. And I started my first job in ecology here in Hampshire, working for the Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre a number of years ago, which will remain completely
important.
No, not at all. So I started working for Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre, and then my career has gone through local government, through private consultancy, through academia and teaching. And about 12 years ago, I found myself miraculously getting a job at the Natural History Museum in London, which is the best office ever, although I know you would argue with that because it is also the best office.
One of the top 5 offices.
Yeah. We have about, I think, 100% more dinosaurs, so...
I give you that, you do have more dinosaurs than you do.
So I've been working at the museum now for about 12 years. I work in the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity, where I do a range of different things because, like anyone who works in museums knows, you get a job title, but you do many, many things.
Wear many hats.
Absolutely. So very, very busy job in the centre there. I run training courses in how to identify things. I work on some of our conservation research around urban nature recovery in particular and things like that. But more recently, my career has also started to shift and my research interests have started to shift a bit as well, because I've always been interested in Gilbert White. Now, to be honest with you, at certain points in my career, I'm not quite sure who's been stalking who, me or Gilbert White, because we seem to have followed ourselves around the country a little bit. Obviously, me moving to Hampshire and realising that one of the people that I used to read when I was a child, his home was here, and bringing my students to the museum and things like that. But then also when I moved to London, I was living in a place called South Lambeth, in fact on South Lambeth Road, and going through Gilbert White's journals and finding that there's records of Gilbert White there in South Lambeth, and I was like, why is he here as well? And he's far beyond Selborne, so that rekindled my interest in actually, well, who was Gilbert White then? If he's not just the naturalist of Selborne, if he's recording in London, who actually is our naturalist? And that has, I was going to say logically, but I'm pretty sure there's very little logic in it. That's actually led me to the point where my research interest is now refocusing on the history of natural history, particularly in the 18th century and particularly around Gilbert White. And I'm now doing a doctorate, a DPhil at the University of Oxford, looking at networks of natural historians, how they work and collaborate together with a particular focus on Gilbert White and how his networks changed kind of over the course of his life. So that's what I do. I'm very lucky as well to work with a lot of different institutions myself. I have my own networks of natural historians, and one of them is here because I am the newest trustee for the Gilbert White Museum as well. I was absolutely delighted to be invited for that as well. So, yeah.
I mean, I definitely can see, because obviously you're doing your PhD at Oxford, but you're not just doing it at any college in Oxford either. You're doing it at Gilbert's College. You were at Oriel.
I had to ask. If I'm going to do it, I had to put Oriel down as the college I wanted to be at, and I was very lucky that that wonderful college, which is celebrating its 700th birthday this year.
Yes.
Just a few weeks ago. They accepted me to do my DPhil at Oriel. So it's absolutely wonderful. Which means that I'm also working in the same spaces that Gilbert was in when he was in Oxford, and also the college has much of his archive as well. Some really interesting pieces in the archive there too.
That's really, so I mean, absolutely following in Gilbert White's footsteps completely. I mean, to be honest, you almost covered his full geographic area.
I've been to Sussex. I've been to Rutland, so I think that's pretty much the extent of it. And I've been to Bath.
Well, there we go. Gilbert's patch is covered. So, one of the things as well that we've worked together on is you brought an exhibition here with the Curious Minds team, all about Thomas Pennant. So do you want to talk a little bit about who Thomas Pennant was, who obviously is the person that this letter is written to, and what your relationship with Thomas Pennant is, as well as Gilbert White?
Absolutely. So we can't really talk about Gilbert White and certainly the Natural History of Selborne without his two major correspondents, Thomas Pennant and James Barrington. So when it comes to Thomas Pennant, I obviously very interested in him and very lucky that at the Natural History Museum we have a large amount of Thomas Pennant's natural history collections, which I've been exploring over the last few years. Anyway, because it's exciting and there are so many and they're so in such incredible condition, which is amazing. But one of the projects that we've been involved in, and I'm a researcher on, is through a project called the Curious Travellers Project. That project is a collaboration between the University of Wales, Trinity St David, University of Glasgow and us at the Natural History Museum, along with various other researchers that we've collected into the wider auspices of the project. And that project is focusing on Thomas Pennant, who was a Welsh naturalist and travel writer and author. Very, very interesting person in his own right. And as we all know from our wonderful Natural History of Selborne, one of Gilbert's main correspondents. Now that project has been looking at Pennant's work across a number of different strands, all funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And we've been looking particularly at his tours of Wales and his tours of Scotland, but then pulling that back into his collections and his specimens and his objects. And at the moment, I'm working on producing a virtual cabinet of curiosity, exploring some of those collections, which is really exciting because I get to work with Thomas Pennant's objects.
That's pretty cool.
As well as his books and everything as well, which is fantastic. So we should also mention as well that this year is Thomas Pennant's 300th birthday on the 14th of June, which is also my birthday as well. So double celebrations this year.
Is like, the universe coming together for all these coincidences.
Absolutely. So we'll be having a big party up in Flintshire with the Thomas Pennant Society later this year as well. So that's
great.
Really cool.
Oh, what a fantastic time to be talking about him then, on his almost his big birthday.
Yeah.
So he and Gilbert were, fairly close in age though, because as I say, Gilbert is 306.
Yes,
year,
exactly.
So.
Yeah, so slightly older, and it's interesting because they were both at Oxford University at about the same time, and technically they were very briefly at Oriel College together.
Oh.
Now, Pennant is best known for being a member of Queen's College, just over the road, across the high street from Oriel. But he briefly defected from Queen's College over to Oriel and then went back before his graduation, so he was very, very briefly. And the lovely thing is, I've done some digging into quite why that is, and it was due to student protests over the quality of the food at Queen's. Our chefs at Oriel are still absolutely wonderful. I can't speak for Queen's, but the Oriel chefs are amazing. So I can see his perspective.
That's such a stupid thing to do. Be like, the food's not good enough here. We're just gonna we're moving colleges.
Absolutely. So that was obviously with the slight age gap. They weren't doing their studies at the same time.
No.
But Gilbert was still a fellow. He was still
in Oxford,
and he was still in Oxford while Pennant was there. I've got no evidence to suggest they ever met at Oxford though.
I mean, obviously they did meet, which is great, but Gilbert does have a fantastic habit of almost but not quite meeting people. So
yeah, it was. Yeah.
the list of people that Gilbert almost but not quite met is long and
Frustrating. From the perspective of a historian.
absolutely. Yeah, and so obviously they did become friends. Where do you think they met? 'Cause we've got a few theories, don't we, about perhaps it could be through Benjamin, Gilbert's brother, but they met and they started corresponding, so something happened in...
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm currently publishing on is Gilbert White's time in London and the amount of time he was spending in London and how that influenced his work, his opportunities, and consequently, at the end of it, his legacy as well. Because London does change Gilbert White quite significantly, as spending time in the city would do. And there's one period when he's in London for 6 months of 1 year. So he's in and out quite frequently. And that's precipitated by two of his brothers, Benjamin, his publisher, and Thomas as well, who moves there initially as an ironmonger on Thames Street. So Gilbert has a place to go and stay in London and accessibility to London. Also, his best friend John Mulso is there for a while, and his family and things like that. So he's got a lot of reasons to go there. But of course, a big draw for Gilbert White is going to be his brother's bookshop, because that's where everybody's going. And the location of that bookshop is pretty critical, because it's almost opposite where the Royal Society was at the time.
Like literal stone's throw, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It's just on the other side of Fleet Street. You have to walk past one or the other. So that's great from a business perspective for Benjamin, because he's got all of his potential authors walking past his shop.
It's like all the great minds of the day just sort of casually wandering past the bookshop, and
It's perfect business positioning. It's absolutely fantastic. But then of course as well, you've got lots of people going in to peruse books and things like that, so you're likely to bump into somebody as well. And for Gilbert, that's a great opportunity, because as he talks about in his letters, he doesn't have much of an opportunity to talk to other naturalists when he's here in Selborne. London's his chance to do that. And this meeting between Pennant and White probably, almost certainly came about through that bookshop. Now, I doubt that was a pure coincidence. I think it's probably to do with Benjamin going, oh, my brother's really interested in this as well. And I know you're working on a second edition of your British zoology, which is really where things start to happen here. Yeah, I think my brother's got some information. Maybe you want to have a chat with him. And we see that in this letter 10, because it's his letter 10 that gives us the first evidence that they did actually meet. And we see literal words saying, when I was in town.
When I was in London,
When I was in town. Town being London, this is when they met. Weirdly though, we don't actually see it in letter 10. We see it in the original version of the letter. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But certainly there's conversations happening in person in London between Thomas Pennant and Gilbert White. Now, there's lots of different ways we can trace that. Some of it's through the letters, as published or in their original form, and some of it is through other bits and pieces of evidence too. They certainly would have met each other at the Royal Society and places like that. So there's lots of opportunity for them to meet and talk. It's not all a correspondence communication.
Yes, they seemed genuinely friends and had similar interests, and it's a fascinating relationship.
It is.
And in the letter, Gilbert White talks about a lot of other naturalists, not necessarily that he had met, but that he was reading at the time. So we were just saying before that Stillingfleet is one that he mentions, but are there any that jump out to you that are of particular interest in thinking about Gilbert White and his sort of network of naturalists?
So for me, Stillingfleet is probably the most interesting out of the ones that he mentions in this letter. He also mentions William Durham as well.
Yes.
Both of these are not people that Gilbert would have met. He's talking about books.
Yes,
books that he knows that his new friend, Thomas Pennant, is also reading. he's doing it in a certain way as well, which positions himself and also says, look, I'm reading these books too, we've got this shared interest, let's be friends, it's that kind of thing.
It's the ultimate sort of, when you meet somebody who, you're something like, oh my God, I've got so much to talk to you about. Have you read this? Have you read that? Have you seen this? Have you seen that? It's exactly.
This letter is quite an interesting one because it doesn't actually really flow.
It doesn't. Well. It's all over the place.
And there's this, and have you seen this about swallows? And what about this new mouse? And also, this falcon. And it really is. He's just trying in a very short amount of space because he's only got a certain amount of paper that he's going to write this letter on. He's trying to get over so much information. Because also this is the first letter, so he doesn't actually know if Pennant's going to reply.
That's so true. The Natural History of Selborne could have been a really short book.
Pennant might not have replied. Pennant had a huge correspondence network, so Gilbert's got to get over to him really quickly. I've got this to tell you, I've got this to talk to you about, I've got this, I'm valuable to you, I've got information to share, and he's got to do that really rapidly, which is why this letter is a bit rapid fire information.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to do it. When I originally had the plan of what each letter was about, and I mean, in the end, we sort of went with this sort of, what we're talking about. But whereas some of them I can go, this one is about the harvest mouse. This one is about migration. This one is about name others topic here. But this one was a mix, which quite often Gilbert's letters are, but this one was really in line by line.
Yes, it is a new subject, I can tell you about this, I can tell you about this, I can tell you about the other. And I think that is part of it. And what we see in the published letters is there's more organisation to them because quite often actually he's combining information from various letters. In here, he isn't doing that same combination, he's retaining that scattergun of information.
Yeah.
It's not the original letter, there's quite a lot of change in it, but he is retaining that, this, which does make it really interesting. So, but I think also the name dropping of, I'm reading Darren, I'm reading Stillingfleet, is quite important. I am connected, I am learned, I am academic, and I'm not just wandering around in the fields looking at wildlife.
Yes.
He's giving himself that academic background.
Which he sort of almost goes back on in one of the letters, must be the one to his first letter to Daines Barrington, where he's like, me, I'm just an outdoor naturalist. I'm just somebody who just wanders around outside looking at stuff. Who doesn't go by the words of others,
But here he's having to position himself in a slightly different way.
I'm an academic.
Yes, exactly.
I've read stuff.
So that's what's going on here. He's not really talking about his actual network, more his library.
Yes,
which
in itself is fascinating because we don't have a list of, an official, Gilbert White doesn't say, and these are the books that was in my library, or does he?
We do to a certain extent, because we've got his will, obviously, which lists the books that are there, and then we've also got his account books, which do list when he's buying certain books as well. So we can pull at least a semi-complete list of the books that Gilbert White had at one stage or another. Some of them we know he passes on to other people, he passes on to nephews and things like that. So they don't always stay with him. And a good library should always be shared. And,
absolutely.
And knowledge should be imparted. But it's really interesting to think about how he's actually positioning himself to this new, well-known published author.
Well, see, that's the other thing, don't we? Obviously, Gilbert White arguably now is the more famous name than Thomas Pennant, but at the time, Gilbert White was a, sort of, I suppose, by 18th century standards, middle-aged, curate from Hampshire that had spent his life observing nature but hadn't really done any formal, whereas Thomas Pennant was a published author on the topic, who had, quite the network and, respectability, and Gilbert was the passionate amateur.
Exactly, that's exactly the case. So Pennant is not only from a different social class as well, he is a gentleman, he is well off, he has inherited the fantastic Downing Hall and the estates and income that comes with things like that. Gilbert White hasn't. He, at this point, would he have inherited from his uncle?
What year are we in?
67 we're in here. I don't think he has. I think this is a year before he inherits, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's around about that time. So he's coming into his inheritance. Yes. So
but at this time, I think it's 68 that he inherits. So 67, he's still renting from his uncle to live here. So I think that's right. So he doesn't own anything at all at this point. He's got his fellowship and a few little incomes and things like that, but he doesn't actually have a huge amount. So he's talking to this landed gentleman who is a very well-known, heavily published author, prolific author, who's well known for working in exactly his subject area. He desperately wants to be friends with this guy, so he's got to offer it. What I find really interesting is the way that he deals with this letter in the original form as well, because it starts quite abruptly.
Yes.
And that's really interesting because it doesn't feel like a first letter to someone.
No, it sort of launches. I mean, it feels like letter 10, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It would feel weird if we're now on letter 10.
I feel like my name's Gilbert.
I'm your new bestie. So it's really interesting to look at how that letter actually changes, because what we need to remember with the publication is that these aren't the letters that he sent to Thomas Pennant.
Which is really interesting, because obviously everybody reading it will assume that, and I mean, for years that's what we were saying, these are the letters, you can still see the postmarks on the, on the manuscript. Yeah. But a lot of what your research has shown is that which is obvious really if you think about it, so heavily edited. The Natural History of Selborne version is not what Gilbert was sending, so many decades earlier.
Obviously, there's significant portions of it that are, but it was heavily edited by Gilbert, by Benjamin, and by others like Molly, to produce a publishable narrative.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this is the first real letter.
Yes.
Those first 9 letters are fictional. And when you look at the manuscript that you have here, which is
an amazing
document, absolutely incredible document, you can see how the original introduction information gets crafted into this letter format, out of lists of information and an original written introduction. So you can see that process of how it's happened. But then also you can see copies of the original letter, and the original version of this letter is in the British Library, along with 29 others, which I've recently done digital transcriptions of and published on the Curious Travellers project. Shameless plug, go and have a look at that.
Very well done. We'll put a link in the YouTube description.
So within those letters, we actually find that this letter is about 50% of the original letter is in this first letter. So that's how much it's been edited.
Really interesting, because that means there's 50% unpublished Gilbert White letter that
out there,
nobody knows about.
Also, the date's wrong as well. I've no idea why. It's only a few days. The published letter is the 4th of August, and the original letter was sent on the 10th. Absolutely no idea why the dates change on these things.
That's odd, isn't it? It's almost, you'd just be like, it was the something of August, let's say 10th. Yeah, maybe.
But what's particularly interesting about this letter is that it misses out the entire first paragraph. And that then changes how he has to write the rest of the letter. Because in the first paragraph, he says...
Of the original letter.
The original letter, yeah. He says, "Nothing but the obliging notice you were so kind to take of my trifling observations in the natural way when I was in town in the spring." So we know then that Gilbert White was in town a few months previously, and that's when he first met Thomas Pennant.
Yeah.
So that places us.
A trifling chat about all things nature.
And Gilbert's been very self-effacing, so my observations are just trifling, they're of no real import, but that sort of thing. But that pins us down to, there was a first meeting, which then solicited this first letter, where Gilbert can then start to say, and we don't have that in the published form.
No.
I think that's lacking. But the fact also that when he says, when I was in town in the spring, by taking out that paragraph, it then changes how he has to write the subsequent paragraphs, and you see more references to, as I said, in town, and things like that later in the published form, because it's not implicit from that first paragraph. So so it's really interesting how the letters actually get edited from the originals in the British Library to the manuscript form that you have here, where we see lots of retranscription and crossing out and changes and shifting things around to the actual published book.
And one of the things that I found really interesting in the research that you did was, and we've just sort of touched on it, I think that the dates of the letters in the manuscript are basically Gilbert's fancy. He sort of just made them up as he goes along, because a lot of the letters are made up of, a bit of this letter and a bit of that, made to make them sort of thematic.
Exactly.
And then of course he had to then work out an order for said letters, but you obviously it's your research, you explain.
That's right, it's exactly like you were saying at the beginning. Some of these podcasts can be really thematic because the letter is quite thematic. So for example, the information on the harvest mouse is combined from a couple of different letters. I think the same with the hedgehog as well. You get the information from 2 or 3 letters on a certain topic combined into a published letter, and then other letters split up and things like that to create more of a logical narrative that a reader is going to be able to follow.
Which makes sense, because if you're like talking with your friends, you go off in multiple directions, and you're not thinking, oh well, this is not going to make any thematical sense to the readers in 300 years' time. Maybe not quite 300 yet, but it's you're just talking, and another thing, and I noticed this, and I noticed that, and you're trying to put all as much news in one letter. So it makes sense that he would have to pick them apart, and seeing them on your grid was wonderful.
This is the thing, and it works out really, really nicely when you actually look at what they've done, because also the publication is much later on as well.
Many decades,
And Gilbert's learnt, as every good naturalist does. He's learnt some things about some of the species he was talking about, particularly those he's speaking about earlier on. And again, when he's referring later on, so I'm having to scroll quickly to look for the right section. When he's talking about Ray's stoparola, he's changed the names that he's using because he now realises what he's originally saying wasn't quite correct. So he's changed it so that it is actually accurate to what he meant, I'm sure, at the time. So some of the information is based on information that he now knows is right. And maybe might have had a few words said if he published the original.
Well, yes, I mean, anybody who wrote something 20 years ago and is now going to publication, and since then you've done 20 years worth more study, and other people have discovered things that did not exist 20 years ago. I mean, gosh,
you couldn't possibly make yourself include that incorrect information. You just wouldn't do it because it's coming out in one go at a particular time. What I do find really interesting about this letter is not just that he's introducing some really big hitters in terms of the species that he's talking about throughout the rest of the book. The house martins in Australia, the swallow, the swift, the big bird hitters, of course.
I was going to say, I mean, sort of, if we were to sort of list the main species, I mean, swallows, harvest mice,
exactly.
they're it's like a greatest hits letter, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's kind of what he was doing to Pennant anyway. But I find it really interesting that this letter is the first one when we get harvest mouse, the hint of his new mouse. his nondescript, yes, right in there with a really big hidden, which is one of my favourites.
By the way, I think I've discovered a new mouse.
Yeah.
Just a hint.
My trifling observation.
Yeah. Although, I mean, we haven't done our Harvest Mouse episode, but obviously he does get picked to the post by that, doesn't he? So
He does. I don't think we should allow any spoilers before you do your Harvest Mouse one.
Yeah, maybe publish your work more than 20 years before after you.
Yeah, we always publish your perish.
But that is it, isn't it? It's a really interesting letter because he does talk about some of the major themes of the book, doesn't he? And Alden talks about swallows. Is there a migration hint? There isn't there?
There's migration, there's hibernation hinted in there, and then we've got the falcon comes in. So we've got some really regular themes that we're then going to meet later on in the book, which is in part coincidence that that's also the subject matter of the first letter. What he doesn't do is add in or take out species information in this letter. And I'm quite pleased that he did, because he keeps the honesty of that letter intact by doing it. Otherwise it would be pretty much another invented letter.
And I think that is the thing, is that obviously the first 9 letters are invented letters, and as much as we're saying, oh yes, the real letters are tampered with, but they are, as much as, they are really Gilbert's words, like they're not very edited.
No, he's not changed the phrasing, and it's still Gilbert's voice that you're hearing in there. Yeah, it's just the subject's a little bit moved around a little bit for that narrative flow.
Yeah. And when you're looking at the manuscript as well, it's interesting in seeing, obviously they've been transcribed, so they've been copied out and things, but my favourite thing is seeing how many times he's changed his mind about what order they're going in. So you'll see letter, and it's always in pencil, and then he finally makes the final decision and puts it in pen. But it'll be like letter 33, 25, 42. And then he'll suddenly be like, no, 30.
Yeah, exactly. Some of that is because I think the decision to do the first 9 letters as letters comes in. I've got a feeling that comes in fairly late.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you do see a jump in all of the letters by about 9 letters.
Do you? Okay, so that's
So all the actual ones which are edited real letters, you do see in that numbering change. You do see that 9-letter jump, and I've just got a hunch that was quite a late decision.
I mean, it would make sense, wouldn't it, to say, this is we need something that, rather than jumping in straight with letters that are between 2 people who know Selborne, well, Pennant hadn't been, but because the first 9 letters are very much like, this is Selborne, this is where it is, this is the kind of geology we have here, this is the kind of, weather we have here. Would you like some extreme data on how many people live here and how many births and baptisms but I always think of them as sort of the scene setting, ready to jump into sort of the more genuine observational writing, and I think it would feel sort of strange just to assume that knowledge going on. And Gilbert's thinking about his audience and thinking about the readability and how he's he was a poet and he loved literature. He understood how and he also was a clergyman. He understood how storytelling worked in terms of sermons. Like, he understood how people took on information, and I think he realised that he needed to make this book readable.
Yeah,
which
absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that. White was an excellent communicator. He had to be. That was his job. He had to be able to talk to absolutely everybody, and that's why I think why his writing is so coloured by that, in terms of it's beautifully elegant writing. But that's true of the letters. That's no different to the letters. He just was a very good communicator. He knew how to spin good yarn.
He did.
Tell a good story. But then you add into that the fact that his brother's business is publication and editing, and then his nieces and nephews and everybody else who's involved in the production of the book. They are all people who are very, very good with words.
Yes, and he'd had a slight experience of how not to write a natural history book, because his brother tried to write a natural history book and didn't quite make it.
It's so frustrating because all we have left of that book is the introduction.
And the couple of quotes that Gilbert includes in his own work.
That's true.
But it is very fragmentary, isn't
Yeah.
it? So, for context, because obviously you guys don't know, you might not necessarily know what we're talking about. Another of Gilbert's brothers, not the publisher or the ironmonger, John, tried to write a natural history book, The Four Campenses, which is essentially like a natural history of Gibraltar, really.
That's exactly.
And my inference from what I can glean from the comments about it was it just wasn't very readable, and that Gilbert enjoyed it for what it was, but kind of got the feeling that others that weren't quite as nerdy as he was found it maybe a little bit hard going, and it was never published.
Yeah, that seems to be the implication that that John and Benjamin could never reach an agreement about how the book should be published, and I think the publication business brain of Benjamin is the thing that won out, because I don't think he thought he could sell it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because a fauna of Gibraltar, you know, would have been a fantastic addition to the body of work we have on natural history. Where we do see that, and that work doesn't disappear though, because through Gilbert, John was able to get his information to Thomas Pennant, and then later John and Pennant collaborated as well, or corresponded as well. So the information which would have gone into the Fauna Calpensis ends up essentially in Thomas Pennant's hands. Towards the end of his life, and he writes about this in another book, which I'll mention in a second, but he produces a series of handwritten manuscripts called his Outlines of the Globe, and those are fascinating, but they're incredibly unknown because they were never published, with one exception. What they were a series of tours, much like he wrote his tour of Wales and his tour of Scotland and his tours in England and things. They covered the history, the landscape, the people, and the natural history. These were all based not on his own observations, but on the observations of others from his vast correspondence network. So he's writing these tours of places he's never been to, he's never going to get to either. So there's tours in South America, there's tours in the south of, there's tours in India. His western and eastern Hindustan, his views of Hindustan are the actual published ones, so they do get published, and then republished later by Thomas Pennant's son David. So you do get some of this information coming out, and the information from John in Gibraltar is his tour of Spain and Andalusia, which includes a Gibraltar section. In one of his published books, which is The Literary Life of the Late Thomas Pennant, by himself, written several years before he died.
Amazing.
Which I think is a great way.
That is a goal. Write your own posthumous biography.
I think that's the way forward. So that no one can get it wrong, just write it yourself.
Yes.
I just adore that title.
I love the 18th century.
I know, it's great. But in that, he does talk about the Outlines of the Globe manuscripts, and he does talk about particularly John White and his contribution to those as well, and he talks about Gilbert White elsewhere in that book as well. So that's really interesting that although we never get the Fauna Calpensis, we do get some of the information. What we don't get is, really frustratingly, as someone who is in part an entomologist, we don't get any of the insect information. There's a lot of information that he doesn't miss out, and that's because back in Literary Life, he does state that he has long abjured the study of insects. I think he was a bit creeped out by bugs, to be honest with you, because he never talks about them.
Well, it's a bit like Gilbert and amphibians.
Well, true, yeah. He mentions toads or things.
Yeah.
He does talk
about them, but
it's not quite there. There are no insects on the planet.
according to as my professional thing as a naturalist, there are no insects. They're all made up. They don't exist.
Don't like them. I'm not studying them.
Poor old John.
I know. I do feel sorry for John.
He does get a rough.
He really does. He gets. But interestingly, while we're on the subject of John, he is the only white to donate a specimen to the then British Museum. So he donates a specimen of pyrite from Selborne to the British Museum in 1758, which got me very, very excited briefly when I found a Mr. White of Selborne donated a specimen of pyrite to the British Museum. I got very excited. There's a Gilbert White specimen in the British Museum. And then I followed it up with the archivist and we delved in a little bit more, and it was John, which is still
pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Still brilliant.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is that it never made it from the British Museum to the Natural History Museum with the other geology specimens. The chances are it's a specimen of pyrite. It probably suffered from pyrite decay, and it's no longer with us, which is very sad.
I mean, that would have been so cool.
But another sad, not quite made it, John Whitetail.
But I do often think that with that whole sort of debacle behind the family and Gilbert thinking, well, I know how not to write a natural history, book. I know that it needs to have some commercial appeal. Must have been in his mind when he was thinking about how to go about writing this one, and picking the format of letters not only makes it incredibly bite-sized and easy to read, but it was a very established and popular literary format in the 18th century. I mean, basically everybody wrote letters and would publish their letters, and I also think it makes them friendly. Like, it's not a cold book, it's Gilbert and Thomas Pennant, and then Gilbert and Daines Barrington, who are friends, talking about a subject that they're very passionate about. And I think I like the fact that there's real important science in there, and then it will be like just a rough little anecdote about something, that it reminds Gilbert of what they're talking about. And the fact that it's now talking about how he's edited the letters, that he decided to leave those anecdotes in.
But also there's so many that he doesn't as well. There's so many little snippets and bits and pieces, and but the thing is they're not related to Selborne, so he's only keeping in things which are relevant to the narrative.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing to remember, that with these letters, it's if he's going to keep in little bits and pieces like that, and they do, of course, they make the whole thing much more personable, make it much more readable, much more human. He's not going to include them if they're not about Selborne.
No, not if they're, don't fit thematically into what he's talking about. Yeah.
So there's entire letters in the British Library collection which aren't at all in Selborne, because he's talking about Gibraltar and John, and it's not relevant. So why would it? There's there's big sections which are just absent because they're not relevant to the narrative.
Oh my gosh, we need a proper, published version of them, like side by side, where we can read.
Yeah. What else was Gilbert interested in?
Well, this is it, isn't it? And it's through his domestic letters that we get glimpses into the fact that he wasn't just a natural historian. He was a proper polymath and was interested in so much, but he had a job to do, and he was writing the Natural History of Selborne, so he's not going to start talking about places that are not to do with the village. He's not going to talk about his observations that he's made in Devon, or observation that he's made in Oxfordshire, observation that he's made. I mean, he does sometimes talk about other places. I mean, I can think, he'll say things. I mean, he talks about Goodwood, and he talks about being on the South Downs towards Ringmer and things like that. So I mean, it does, but it's thematic to what he's talking about.
Talking about natural history. He's not talking about some of the political things that he brings in. He's not talking about some big news stories.
No.
In the same way that when he's writing to his family, he's not bringing a lot of that in.
No.
He's writing things for different reasons and to different people. And it's thinking about who the audience is, who the intended audience is, and they're very different when you're writing to when you're writing your first letter to the famous author and naturalist Thomas Pennant, as opposed to when you're talking to a much wider audience, hopefully, of all the readership of your book.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting. I always trying to think about who he thought that audience was going to be, and I think he does a really good job of really talking to everyone, because from a point of view of somebody who is not by any means a naturalist, living 200 years, 250 years after its publication, it's still, pretty accessible, to me, because of the language and because of the, the scenes that it conjures up is what hooked me to the Natural History of Selborne before I understood, anything else about it, and that would have been the same for his 18th century readers and the 19th century readers.
Exactly. He wouldn't have imagined for one second, I'm sure, that 250 years later we'd still be sat in his house talking about his book. Wouldn't have imagined that at all.
No.
But he's writing in such a personable, beautiful way that it still inspires us today. That's not his intended audience, but he is such a capable writer that's actually what we get. We still get something which inspires us now to be more curious, to go outside, to look at natural history, and to enjoy the world that he enjoyed very much still today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've talked about quite a lot of your projects. Is there anything we haven't covered that we want to? We talked about the curious travellers, haven't we, in your up and coming studies? Anything else that we haven't covered?
Well, I've just had a publication come out, haven't I, about Gilbert White?
Oh, yes, we should
just
talk
a very
about
short little one. So a little short note which appeared a few weeks ago in the Archives of Natural History, which is the journal of the Society for the History of Natural History.
It's one of my favourite names of an organisation.
It's excellent. It does exactly what it says.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. And it's a fantastic organisation as well. I should definitely say that. If you're interested in the history of natural history, it's absolutely the place to be. And the journal is excellent. So I had a little short note in there, in their last issue, which just got over, I think, for me, just a little thorny thing that keeps popping up.
I don't know what you're talking about, Steph.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I agree with you. I'm not.
But it's the question of, was Gilbert White the first person to write kisses as X's at the end of his letters? And I'm really sorry, I don't believe he was at all. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
So it was exploring the handwriting issue, which I think has actually generated that question. It's really interesting for me that when we ran a conference here last year,
which you organised,
which I co-organised with the wonderful Professor Birkin Carey at the University of Northumbria. So we co-hosted a conference for 3 days here, talking about Gilbert White in his context, all the various facets. So enjoy it. One of the questions which still at that came up was, did Gilbert White write the first kiss?
Yeah.
And I'm afraid I don't think he did. I think he was writing, how he writes his ampersands with a C for etc. At the end of his letters.
Oh, there you go. So the context of this is, when I first came to this job, one of the most exciting things was the Oxford English Dictionary had Gilbert White listed as the first person ever to use X as a kiss at the end of, and I was like, this is brilliant. And even then, I don't think I was overly convinced, because it's so the letter in question is a letter to his friend Catherine Batty, and it's a strange letter in itself. Basically, it's like, I like to think of it as like a hungover note, where they've been at a party and he's basically writing like he writes sort of, it's a sort of I suppose you could read it as slightly flirty, but it's sort of a very friendly, informal note. And then at the end, he sort of says with a Paternoster and an Ave Maria, and then it's just
many X's.
and then about loads and loads and loads of X's, and everybody was like,
"Oh,
Gilbert." And then there was almost immediately, we published a blog about it, and then almost immediately the OED revoked it.
So it's still there.
Is
It's
it?
not revoked. It is
Oh,
still there.
okay.
Yeah.
But
It's still
anyway.
in there. But so there's two things. So the Mania XXXXX is actually how he corrects himself and also censors himself as well. So it's never been that.
Yeah.
The other one that has also come up is at the end, and it's "I'm your humble servant X," which could have come from the actual root that we do get the X as a kiss, which does come out in the 18th century because Jane Austen talks about it as happening in letters. But we don't have any 18th century examples of it actually in written form. And that comes from, at the end of a letter, you would write a crucifix at the end of a psalter, at the end of your letter, to go, basically putting blessings on this letter.
Yes.
I'm very pious, so are you, here are blessings on this letter. And that's where the X actually comes from, because that blessing turns into fond regards, which turns into kisses. In Gilbert's terms, there's two versions which have been argued about. There's the Mania XXXX. That's an editorial thing. Then there's also this X at the end of his letters, which does look like an X. It's just a quirk of handwriting, I'm afraid. It's an ampersand. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, to be honest, it would be strange for, how old is he? 68, so a 48-year-old, man to be sending letters with that many kisses on them to a 19-year-old, is
and it's not. And equally, he's not sending kisses to Thomas Pennant either.
No, I mean,
it would be unusual.
It would be.
So it's a little short note article, just putting to bed, I hope.
It will keep emerging its head. It will keep emerging its head. I mean, you only have to look at the portraits of Gilbert White and how they keep still popping up, and I'm like, how have we not just gotten over the fact that that picture is not of Gilbert White?
It's always going to keep coming back. It's just going to keep coming back. But at least I've done that in writing. But I should also say as well that the other project that we're hopefully going to be working on, it's not confirmed yet, but we're also hoping, Bracken and I, as Professor Bracken Carey at the University of Northumbria, we're hoping to do a publication of some of the conference proceedings from our conference last year as well. So hopefully that will be, we'll be working on that in the not too distant future as well. So
which would be so good, because one of the really nice things that came out of that conference was sitting in a room with ecologists, with historians, with
clergymen, teachers, everybody.
English literature, and having so many different research angles that were all related to Gilbert White all in one room was something really, really remarkable, and how Gilbert White fits into so many people's area of interest.
How broad his legacy really is. I mean, it was an idea that Bracken and I had both had kind of separately initially, and then we started talking, and actually that conversation came about from the Gilbert White Tercentenary, which is where Bracken and I first got to know each other from the events that we had online because COVID were here. So that was we always thought something might work, but I have to admit it worked out. It was just incredible to have that many people. So we had people fly over from the US to talk about Gilbert White and their work. We had people from, we had current ecologists. We had Jean Chatfield, who I know has been on the podcast, and previous curator, talking about her years of recording in Selborne and how that compares. We had clergymen talking about how his sermons relate, and the theological side of Gilbert White, historians, literature people, everybody. And what really interested me as well was that in our final session we had so much talk about inspiring the next generation of naturalists through some of the work that teachers and educators have been doing, working with Gilbert White in schools and with school groups as well. And that was particularly heartening to see that next generation of Gilbert's legacy happening too.
Yeah. This podcast will be going on for years. No, that's really exciting, and I think it shows just how relevant Gilbert White is and how much there still is to learn about him, because I came away knowing so much more about Gilbert White than I went in with, and having so many more questions about Gilbert White and so many more contacts as well to discuss the topic with. I mean, it was so worthwhile.
We built our own Gilbert White networks.
We did, and we had our own naturalist journal on the side, and that people were filling in over the weekend.
Yeah, that was lovely.
It was, and so special to be able to do it in Selborne as well, and not be somewhere
in a conference centre.
So, leading us very nicely, so we ask all of our guests at the end of the interview how a way that they could suggest to our listeners to be a little bit more Gilbert. Do you have a suggestion, Steph?
Be more Gilbert. I mean, it's a wonderful phrase, that, isn't it? I really like that one.
I can't claim credit that goes to Fiona, our education manager, during the pandemic. But we have used it and ran with it for the past 6 years. I think she came up with it during the depths of the pandemic.
And long may it continue. So you can all, but the thing is, there are so many ways that you can be a little bit more Gilbert. The thing that always inspires me, though, about Gilbert and his approach is it comes back to my favourite word, which is curiosity. And just using our innate curiosity to remind ourselves to be out in nature, to make those observations, to do what in the context of a project of mine, that a friend of mine is working on, the arts of attention. Just paying that little bit of attention, being curious, paying attention. That's all you need to do to be more Gilbert. And what that means is you don't need to go off exploring around the world to do that. You can be curious right on your doorstep. Yeah. You can be curious about the natural world from this side of the window. Yeah. And just be there and watch and spend that little bit of time. So for me, to be more Gilbert, you just need to be curious about what's in the
perfect. And I mean, that is, Gilbert to a T. I mean, you can't. It's probably one of my best words to sum him up, really, he was a curious man.
He was, certainly, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Steph, for chatting to us. I have a sneaking suspicion that you will be back to talk about other topics. So this is definitely not the last that we'll be seeing you on the Natural Podcast.
I hope so. I have had no opportunity yet of procuring any of those mice which I mentioned to you in town. The person that brought me the last says that there are plenty in harvest, at which time I will take great care to get more, and will endeavour to put the matter out of doubt, whether it be a nondescript species or not.
So, I decided to bring Steph with me for our object of the podcast, and this is not something that I'm going to be able to put on display separately because it is always on display, which is the manuscript of the Natural History of Selborne. It is the most special thing that we have in the museum, bar none. And yes, in this it's got a few of the things that we've been talking about with the episode. So Steph and I were just saying about how the handwriting is different from one page to another, which I think is probably a nephew and niece has transcribed.
Most likely. So you can see that some of it is very definitely Gilbert's handwriting. This one over here, this is definitely Gilbert White's handwriting. It's unmistakable. It's quite different. But over here, the left hand, we've got the reverse side of another previous letter here, and it's absolutely not Gilbert White's handwriting. he uses a number of different nephews and nieces to rewrite some of his letters, and that also happens in the originals as well. He makes no bones about it when he's writing to Pennant in some of the letters. He says specifically, he apologises for using an amanuensis to write the letter for him, and says that it's because he's writing so many letters that his hand's hurting. So he clearly has a really significant network of correspondents who he's always writing to. Plus then he's writing his sermons and things like that. So there's a lot of handwriting. I mean, writing with a quill is probably quite hard, so it probably does make your hand hurt. So he does regularly use other people to handwrite his letters.
Random teenagers he finds around the house.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what else are you supposed to do with them, really, other than get them to write out your letters? What he usually does when he's sending them to people is he will always write the sort of sign off, the I am your humble servant, etc. And then if he's putting a postscript in, he'll do that in his own handwriting as well. Occasionally he'll go back through and correct the spelling and stuff when young nephew or whatever has made a bit of a mistake there. But so quite often we see other people writing the actual letter, presumably he's dictating it.
Yes, and as I say, this has probably been copied out and then he's corrected and made a few changes, like changed the phrasing a little bit and added a couple of, rather than he's gone on a naked soil rather than
and so you can see here ground has been turned to soil and things like that. So what he does when the team of them who are working on this book, what they do is they take the original letters and then copy them out. So some of the initial changes happen on that first copying out, and you can see some of those initial edits happening on the original letters which aren't in the manuscript. You see some of the crossings out and things happening there. Then you see the first draft manuscript version coming into this document, and then you'll see numerous edits happen on this document as they work out just how to shape this whole thing around. And like you were saying in the podcast, some of that comes down to the numbering at the top. Because obviously this, he didn't write to Thomas Pennant to the same letter 42. He didn't write that. But then that's been corrected to letter 41. You can see 42 has been crossed out, it's been changed. So you can see how this is starting to build.
It's an active working document, isn't it? That's the thing. It's not being copied out in your best neat handwriting to be sent to the printers. It's a working document, and we don't have this anymore. Now we just use word processors.
And we might track changes a few times, and then we just delete all those track changes. This shows the track changes essentially for how they built the Natural History from the original letters. I said, by and large, this isn't the original letters. This is a manuscript copy, and the original letters are elsewhere, with a couple of exceptions. There are some of the original letters in here. If you look really carefully, I think it's that wax from a seal just poking out there. So there's one or two. When we went through this a few years ago, didn't we? We found that some of them still have the address and the seal on the back of them. So in some cases, they've got the original. And actually, conversely, I think there's a couple of manuscript copies in the British Library. So I think there might have been a bit of a shimmy.
Bit of a mix-up.
Bit of a shimmy, maybe. You never know. So it's really interesting to see how we went from the original letters sent as part of that correspondence through the manuscript and then into that final publication. It's fascinating.
It is really fascinating. And if you want to look through it, we have a digitised version of it on our website, so you can flick through the pages of the manuscript yourself, or you could come and visit us and see the real thing.
The parish I live in is very abrupt, uneven country, full of hills and woods, and therefore full of birds.
So thank you so much to Steph for coming to visit. You will be hearing a lot more from her, I am sure. If you want to come and see the manuscript yourself, please do pop along. So see you soon.